Korea's history is that of a small nation maneuvering between the larger and more powerful countries that surround it. Historically, it has had to deal with China, Russia, the Soviet Union, Japan, and the USA. Korea has never been the center of the world, but it has often been the center of conflict between larger and more powerful nations. And in this video, we will talk about modern-day North and South Korea and how these two countries, which are very similar, developed differently all the way up to today. We will talk about politics and economics, propaganda and social issues, war and geopolitics, but most importantly, K-pop. This video will mostly cover the history of North and South Korea, but before we can talk about these countries themselves, we need to talk about how they were created. And for that we need to start in 1895. And there is a very good reason for this specific date. Because for thousands of years East Asia was dominated by China. China had a large population and military, the best products and technology, the most efficient education and bureaucracy. But where most other superpowers used their dominance to colonize and conquer other peoples, China decided on a system of tributary states. Japan, Cambodia, Malaysia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Tibet, Ryukyu, and of course Korea. All and more paid tribute to China, a country so powerful that for hundreds of years in its history, no other country on earth could even come close to the industrial, economic and political power of China. But unlike most other vassals, Korea wasn't just a tributary state. It had adopted the Chinese form of governance, the Chinese religion of Confucianism, and closed itself off from the outside world just like China had. Korea had adopted the Chinese way of doing things to such an extent that they were often better at it than the Chinese themselves. But what many did not realize at the time was that China was in decline, a slow decline. So slow in fact that nobody realized it for hundreds of years. Because around 1500 the first Europeans sailed around Africa and established contact with Chinese tributary states. This doesn't seem like a problem at first, but the Portuguese established colonies, taking power away from China. This was soon followed by other Europeans such as the Dutch, the Spanish, the British and the French, each establishing colonies in Chinese tributary states. And with every new colony, China lost a tributary state, until the year 1839, when the First Opium War began and China itself was attacked by European powers. But there was one tributary state which remained safe throughout all of this: Korea. While Sri Lanka was taken by the British, Vietnam by the French, and Chinese ports by various European powers, Korea only had to deal with minor skirmishes from France, the United States and Japan. But other than that, Korea remained a Chinese puppet state. But then, everything changed when the empire upon which the Fire Nation is based attacked. The First Sino-Japanese War was a war between the Qin dynasty of China and the Empire of Japan in 1894 and 1895. Just 40 years earlier, Japan was like China and Korea in that it shut itself off from the rest of the world until the United States forced Japan to open up. But Japan had since been modernizing its country. Modern industry, modern government and a modern army. And this modern army was victorious. And as a result, the dominant power in East Asia shifted away from China and towards Japan. And Korea was forcefully shifted with it. For over 1,000 years of being a vassal state of China, Korea was now an independent country. Not because it sought independence, but because independence was thrust upon them by the Japanese. And this is why 1895 is such an important year in Korean history. Because this is the year that Korea stopped being a Chinese tributary state, isolated from the rest of the world, and became an independent Korea. And this independent Korea was surrounded by countries which were far more powerful than itself. And so Korea had to learn to maneuver between the various powers to secure its own survival. and this position of being surrounded by more powerful countries remains true to this day. The Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Japan, the United States, all of them have one thing in common. They were or are the most powerful countries in the world, and all of them have had a stake in the Korean nations. This newly independent Korea faced many difficulties. To the west was a declining China. To the north was an emboldened Russia which sought greater influence in East Asia. And to the east was the Empire of Japan, an empire which itself was surrounded by more powerful and more advanced European empires and was desperately seeking ways to secure its own independence from those European powers which were creating colonies closer and closer to Japan. Each of these nations was far larger, far more advanced, and far more powerful than Korea. So, what did Korea do? Korea decided to modernize and westernize, using Japan as a model on how to do so. Korea reorganized its army to be more Western, receiving modern training and weapons from Russia. It improved its education system by opening public schools, colleges, and universities. In fact, many of the universities in Korea today were founded in the time of this Korean Empire. The government promoted industrialization by investing in new types of machines, such as low-cost silk spinning and weaving machines, which could outcompete high-cost manufacturing abroad and make a lot of profit by exporting cheap silk to rich countries. It built new infrastructure, such as electric streetcars, water companies, telephone lines, and a power grid, and its government was to become more Western, with even royalty donning the clothes of Western monarchs in order to emulate them. And in 1897 it even changed its name. For centuries, the nation inhabiting the Korean peninsula was actually called Joseon.
Joseon.
Was actually called Joseon, but was renamed the Korean Empire. Korea had moved away from China and was now moving towards closer ties with Russia. They were hoping that Russia could not only help Korea to industrialize, but also help to secure Korean independence. But why did Korea seek close ties with Russia when it had just gained independence from China? Well, the reason for this is that Japan had been discussing invading Korea for decades. In fact, Japan had already decided that it was going to invade Korea. It just hadn't decided when it would invade Korea. Japan argued that Korea was an inferior nation, which failed to modernize and therefore ought to be conquered by the superior Japanese nation. This point of view is comparable to how European nations viewed African and Asian nations at the time. And so, with both Russia and Japan wanting control over Korea in order to gain more influence in East Asia, the two sides fought a war in 1904, which Japan won. As a result, Korea was forced to become a protectorate of Japan in 1905. But Korea was too weak to hold off the Japanese. And in 1910, Korea officially became a colony of the Empire of Japan. The period of history where China lost its position as the dominant power in East Asia is called the Century of Humiliation in China. But while China was humiliated, Korea was used, abused, and subdued. Japan treated Korea as its colony. This meant that Japan sought to civilize the Koreans by banning the Korean language, customs, and traditions in favor of Japanese language, customs, and traditions. For example, Koreans were forced to change their Korean names to Japanese names. Korean labor was exploited to harvest resources, Korean infrastructure built to transport those resources to Japan, and those resources were turned into products used for Japanese consumption and expanding Japanese control over Korea and other areas of East Asia. While various aspects improved for the Koreans, the literacy rate went up, factories were built, and infrastructure was improved, These improvements were combined with a regime so brutal that they would eventually be considered war crimes at the Tokyo trial. A prominent example of the brutality was the establishment of various agencies that lured women and girls to their offices with the promise of better work and education, only for them to be turned into slaves and sent across the Japanese Empire to perform intimate services and be used by Japanese men as they pleased. The effect the Japanese occupation on Korea had was so severe that when Japan lost World War II and had to end its occupation of Korea, that the Koreans lacked almost all administrative and technical expertise to run their own country. This is because the Japanese Empire almost exclusively used Japanese citizens to administer its Korean colony, meaning there were almost no Koreans left anymore who had experience in running a country. And so now it's 1945 and the Japanese were leaving, but while they were leaving, the Soviet army was arriving. And so, once again, Korea was fought over by larger, more powerful nations. This time, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. Because the Cold War was beginning, and in this Cold War the main weapons used were ideology and proxy wars, with the Soviet Union and its allies turning towards Soviet-style communism, and the USA and its allies turning towards capitalism. And each side wanted control over Korea for its strategic position in East Asia. And the USA became afraid that the Soviets would occupy all of Korea. So the USA tasked two young officers to come up with a proposal on how to split Korea between the Soviets and the US. Without much knowledge of Korea and without consulting experts on Korea, they took a National Geographic map and decided that a line on that map, called the 38th parallel, would be a good way to divide Korea so that each side would have approximately half the Korean territory. To the surprise of the USA, the Soviets immediately accepted the division, unaware that the Russian Empire discussed sharing Korea along the exact same line with Japan, and that they were giving the Soviets exactly what they wanted all along. And so, after more than 1,000 years of a unified Korean peninsula, the country was torn apart between the Soviets and the USA. This split was meant to last for 5 years, after which Korea would be turned back to the Koreans in a united Korean state, similar to how Austria was split and reunified after World War II. Most Koreans demanded immediate independence, but their voices were ignored. The USSR and USA met several times to discuss how Korea will be united. The Soviets proposed Leon Hyun as the leader of a united Korea. I apologize to all Koreans for my pronunciation. But this was rejected by the USA. The Soviets proposed both sides withdraw and let the Korean people form their own united government. But this too was rejected by the USA. So the USA brought the problem to the United Nations, which declared that both sides should withdraw and free elections be held. But the Soviets boycotted this resolution, arguing that the UN couldn't guarantee fair elections. As time went on, the two nations diverged, and over time the Soviet Union and USA each established a different national government in the Korean territory they controlled. In the north, a provisional government was created by the USSR in 1946 under the leadership of Kim Il-sung. He was chosen by the Soviets to lead North Korea for his close ties with the Soviet government. When talking about North Korea, it is important to note that there is very little information about this country. The closer we are to the present, the less information we have. I will try to be as accurate as possible, but if there are any North Koreans in the audience who have better access to this information, then please correct me or add information to me. North Korea faced many of the same issues previous Korean entities faced. They were surrounded by the powerful Soviet Union to the north and the powerful United States to its south. North Korea therefore needed to become a useful client state to the Soviet Union and quickly adopted Soviet-style governance. It instituted land reforms where land owned by Japanese citizens, Korean collaborators, and landlords were redistributed among poor farmers. The government took control over many businesses and gave women more equality compared to men. As a result of these reforms, the elites lost most of their power, and many of these collaborators, Japanese and elites, fled south. And just like the Soviet Union, North Korea removed domestic opposition and implemented a one-party state, where the government only has a single political party, the Workers' Party of Korea. Over time, Kim Il-sung became the nation's absolute ruler, and to keep the people from rebelling, a cult of personality was formed around him and his dynasty. In southern Korea, the United States took over the governance of the region. There actually was a Korean government in exile living in China, and they did send a delegation to meet with the US occupation force. But the US general in charge refused to meet them, refused to recognize them, and on December 12, 1945, outlawed this Korean government. The US occupation was met with resistance when, in 1946, Koreans started rebelling against the US presence in their country. But the power of the people could not stand up to the power of the US military, resulting in 30 to 100,000 extinguished lives. Over time, an anti-communist man named Syngman Rhee became a popular leader in South Korea. Being the first president of the now outlawed provisional government and having worked as a pro-Korean lobbyist in the USA, making him popular with the Koreans and the United States. After it became clear that Korean unification would not happen, the USA called for general elections in South Korea to be held in 1948. This came as a shock to the Koreans, who now realized that their US occupiers had abandoned the Korean call for unification, and once again protests and rebellions rose up across South Korea. But they too were no match for South Korean and US militaries. And again, tens of thousands of Koreans were murdered for the dream of a united Korea. But eventually South Korean elections were held on May 10th, and Syngman Rhee won the election. 3 months later, on August the 15th, the United States handed over power to the South Korean government, which officially declared itself as the Republic of Korea. 3 weeks later, North Korea did the same and officially proclaimed itself as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so, in 1948, both the Soviet and US armies withdrew from the Korean peninsula, and for the first time in 38 years, Koreans were ruling Korea. But North Korea faced two very important issues. Two issues which it hasn't resolved to this very day. The first issue is food. You see, North Korean soil is not very suitable for agriculture. When the Japanese were in control, they placed most farms in the south, where the soil was more arable, while placing most factories in the north, where there were more natural resources. The second issue is that of a competitor backed by one of the most powerful countries in the world. You see, if South Korea were to prosper, then it would be a clear sign to its people that South Korean capitalism was more effective than North Korean communism. This could result in civil unrest and possible annexation of North Korea by South Korea. And they weren't wrong to think that, because something similar would happen between East and West Germany in the 90s. And so how did North Korea try to solve these issues? Well, North Korea did what previous Korean entities had done, allying itself with more powerful countries. In North Korea's case, it stayed a close ally of the USSR, and not long afterwards, mainland China became communist, meaning that North Korea now had two communist nations it could rely on for help. And North Korea requested help from its allies to invade South Korea. This would remove their capitalist rival, remove US influence, and gain them the fertile land they needed to reliably feed their people. And so on June 25th, 1950, the Korean War began. I won't go into detail about the Korean War because I am a history scope, not a tactical scope. So in short, North Korea was at first successful, then South Korean allies such as the USA sent troops to defend the South. They were so successful that they conquered all the way up to the Chinese border, at which point China sent about 500,000 troops to support North Korea, after which the borders became similar to what they were before the war. From 1951 until 53, the two sides kept fighting, but no major territorial change would occur. By 1953, the Soviet government changed leadership and was now open to a ceasefire. And so, after 3 years, the Korean War came to an end with an armistice. Once again, both Koreas had to rely on their allies for survival. And by now, it was clear to both sides that Korea won't be united. As part of the treaty, a demilitarized zone was established. And to prevent anyone from getting too depressed from watching this video so far, the DMZ's ecosystem is a fascinating one. While it's one of the most dangerous places for humans to be, this has basically turned it into the best defended nature preserve in history. This zone includes many ecosystems from forest to estuaries to wetlands, with many migratory birds resting here. In fact, it's a sanctuary for hundreds of bird species such as the endangered white-naped crane and the red-crowned crane, as well as dozens of species of fish, Asiatic black bears, lynxes and many other mammals. Alright, back to depression. At first, North Korea relied on other communist nations for support, such as food, technical aid and military assistance in order to rebuild North Korea after the war. But it soon embraced an ideology called Juche. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay, I also had a Eurocentric education. Juche is an ideology based on self-determination and self-reliance. So, for example, instead of importing food from other countries, they would try to produce it themselves, along with as many goods and services as possible, so North Korea wouldn't be dependent on other nations for its economy. And the Soviet-style communism North Korea adopted fit well with this policy, because Soviet-style communism is that of a command economy. So instead of the people owning the means of production, it was the government who owned the means of production, from factories to farms to shops. With this important position in the economy, the North Korean government could try to implement this policy of Juche. But this type of economic policy is generally quite a bad economic policy. While you could try to make everything you need yourself, it's a lot more efficient to focus on a few things you're really good at and then trade those goods and services for things that you want or need. For example, North Korea had a lot of mineral resources which it could trade for food, something which North Korea lacked enough of. But this is where we need to remember Korean history. Korea had been reliant on China for 1,000 years, but when China was defeated, Korea was dragged with it. Then it relied on the Russian Empire, who was defeated in a war and led to the colonization of Korea. North Korea learned that relying on other nations made Korea vulnerable in the modern world. With this historical context, it is logical why North Korea isolated itself from the outside world and began the process of self-reliance with the Juche ideology. And this policy of adopting the ideology of whichever larger country the Korean government had aligned itself with was nothing new. As we saw, when Korea was under the Chinese sphere of influence, it was more Confucian than the Chinese. And now that North Korea aligned itself with the Soviet Union, they were more communist than the Soviets. But what about South Korea? What many people don't know about South Korea is that it used to be a lot like North Korea. Its people could not travel abroad without government permission, rampant poverty, large-scale corruption, massacres, relying on other countries for financial aid, and while officially there were elections, it was effectively a dictatorship. And in the years following the Korean War, the government was primarily focused on securing its own power by suppressing opposition. But in 1960, South Korea erupted in protests due to rigged elections and corruption. After protesters were injured by the police, the president resigned and a military coup took control of the country in 1962. This government was headed by a man named Park Geun-hye, but this government faced two major issues. On one side, the country was very corrupt, while on the other side, the people were protesting. These issues were made worse by North Korea, because if a communist North Korea was the best Korea, then the people might demand a unified Korea under that communist North Korean leadership. And so, South Korea needed to show to the people that living under the South Korean government was better than living under the North Korean government. And the way this new government wanted to show this to the people was by making South Korea a much richer country than North Korea. The early South Korean economy relied a lot on exporting resources and labor-intensive manufactured goods such as tungsten, fish and cheap garments. But they didn't bring in a lot of profit. So what policies could South Korea implement to become a rich nation? In today's world, one can find plenty of examples of poor countries which rapidly developed into rich countries in just a few decades. One could look at Vietnam, Singapore, China, Taiwan, Greece, or even South Korea itself. All countries which have or had rapidly developing economies. But in 1960 there was only a single country which had ever been able to go from a poor country to a rich country in just a few decades. Japan was growing at around 10% per year, and even before World War II went from a feudal economy to a developed economy in just a few decades. And so South Korea once again decided to adopt the policies of its larger and more powerful neighbor. Japanese-style state capitalism. And just as North Korea would become more communist than the Soviets, so too would South Korea become more state capitalist than the Japanese. But what is state capitalism? Well, in the case of Korea, it used something called indicative planning. This is a system where a government sets broad targets for a capitalist economy to reach, such as, for example, investments in certain industries, export, infrastructure development, etc., and it would then work together with private businesses to achieve this goal. South Korea began by promoting various businesses which would become the mascots of the South Korean economy. In particular, the government promoted family-owned businesses. This is because family-owned businesses have one major advantage: longevity. Because if your business is owned by shareholders, then those shareholders don't care if the business still exists in 100 years. They only care about short-term profit. But if you know your children and grandchildren will inherit that business after you retire, then you want to make sure that this business will be successful for a long time. In fact, this system of promoting family-owned businesses in South Korea is called chaebol, which literally means rich family. But how would the government make sure that these mascot companies would succeed? Well, the South Korean government would make it easier to get permits, ban foreign competitors from entering the South Korean market, and provide them with a vast amount of money to make them succeed. At the time, all banks in South Korea were owned by the government, and so the government had access to all the savings in the country. It then used these savings to invest in these mascot companies. But in exchange for practically endless investments, the South Korean government would tell these mascot companies in which industries they had to do business. And Korea was quite forceful in its approach. In the 1960s, the South Korean government banned the LG Group from going into the textile industry and forced them to start producing electric cables, eventually resulting in LG's world-famous electronics we know today. In 1970, the Korean government pressured Hyundai Group to start a shipbuilding company. When Hyundai refused, the president threatened them with bankruptcy. Today, Hyundai Shipbuilding Company is one of the biggest in the world. And in the 60s, the government wanted to build a steel mill. But South Korea didn't produce iron or coking coal, two key ingredients in modern steelmaking. Being capitalist, it couldn't import these from communist China or the USSR and had to import these materials all the way from Australia and North America. Investors therefore thought that this was a silly idea and South Korea couldn't find any investors. Except for one. After World War II, Japan had to pay war reparations to South Korea as repayment for 35 years of colonization. South Korea used this money to build a steel mill, which began production in 1973. It became so successful that today it is one of the largest steel producers in the world. And these were not isolated incidents. The government would often threaten to cut off government finance or even send in the secret police to convince the bosses to do as they were told. Over time, these chaebol family companies would do business in many different fields. To give a famous example, the South Korean company Samsung is involved in smartphones, ovens, televisions, biotechnology, batteries, and even produces ultrasound machines. So perhaps your very first picture was taken with a Samsung ultrasound. But making family companies wealthy wouldn't necessarily translate into making the average South Korean citizen wealthy. And so the government implemented a wide range of policies to make sure that the profits earned by large corporations would be reinvested into the average people. For example, it subsidized fertilizer to improve crop yields and thus boosted the profits of rural farmers. Large-scale housing programs were created, wealth-sharing programs, building new schools and universities, emphasizing vocational training, and much more. This was not done to help the average South Korean citizen, not at all. The reason was that improved living conditions for the people would legitimize the government's rule over the country in the eyes of those people whose lives it improved, fearing that high income inequality might bring about a communist revolution in South Korea. Throughout South Korea's history, the government was the leading driver in economic growth, but a lot of its plans were seen as impractical, inefficient, or just plain stupid. But the South Korean government did it anyway, and achieved successes greater than most outsiders would have ever considered possible. This method of economic management was so successful that the average income per person grew around 6 to 7% per year between the 60s and 90s. To put this into perspective, at the same time in Western Europe, this rate was around 3.5 to 4% per year on average. This extraordinary economic growth for that time was called the Miracle on the Han River, or the South Korean Miracle. In today's world, South Korea is seen as the preferred Korea to live in, but back in the 1960s, North Korea was a serious contender for Korean hegemony. But why is this the case? The North Korean economy after the Korean War performed better than that of its southern counterpart. This is in large part because North Korea had almost everything it needed within its own border to create industry. It is rich in magnesite, zinc, iron, tungsten, anthracite, and gold. It had a large amount of factories to turn those raw materials into goods, and it had plenty of coal and forests to generate electricity for those factories and its people. Over time, the North Korean economy became more and more intertwined with the military, where many industries were under army control, such as infrastructure, construction, and logistics. North Koreans are allowed to join the military at 17, and almost all men join the army out of tradition, to gain opportunities in life, or out of a sense of duty for the country. The army and the economy are nearly synonymous in North Korean society, where the government promotes unity of soldier and the people. This is in large part because of Korea's history. It has been used by Japan to invade China, twice. It had been used by the Mongols to invade Japan, twice. And it was occupied by foreign powers, twice. And so North Korea built a strong defensive military, where nearly all men received military training and where the country had a large arsenal of weapons it could use for offensive and defensive actions. Should North Korea ever get invaded, it would have millions of soldiers able to fight a guerrilla war until the occupation of North Korea became too costly for their enemy and would have to retreat. North Korea's actions are in many ways shaped by its history of foreign invasion and the fear that that history will repeat itself. From the beginning, the government implemented a vast propaganda program which permeates nearly all parts of North Korean society to keep its people in line and promote national unity. For example, it communicates to the people that no matter how mundane your job may be, that you are an important part of the country and that therefore the country will take care of you. This is not only a way to prevent the people from rebelling by giving them a sense of belonging, but also to motivate workers to be as productive as they can be to support the greater good. And while North Korea lacks the soil to produce enough food and refuses to import sufficient food from abroad, often leading to famine, that this struggle is shared amongst all the people of North Korea. And this propaganda is omnipresent in the nation. Let's turn on the North Korean anthem for this. Ah, beautiful. Propaganda vans equipped with large speakers playing music, news and propaganda are present at construction sites, coal mines and other large working sites. While I would like to give a more chronological event of North Korean propaganda, there isn't that much information on it. In fact, I only found a single book which goes in depth on the subject of North Korean artistic expressions, which you are looking at right now. Common slogans are "My country is the best", which is also the name of a popular North Korean song, "Beautiful Land of Korea". You can find these slogans on the buses of North Korea, and many forms of North Korean art, film and literature are focused on the youth, focusing on the heroism of young people and their contribution towards the future of their nation. If you want to see more modern forms of North Korean propaganda, you can do so right here on YouTube. There's a channel called Echo of Truth. Now I can't say for sure that it's a 100% propaganda channel, so judge for yourself. There will be a playlist with various North Korean culture and propaganda at the end of this video, such as Morabong, a popular North Korean band with themes such as loyalty, patriotism, the military, science and technology. Now, it is important to state that North Koreans aren't any different from anybody else. After all, they go to work, play sports, care for their children, just like everywhere else in the world. A baker will worry whether his bread will rise in North Korea just as a baker in South Korea, South Africa or South America would. And outdoor barbecues in parks, singing, dancing and group saunas are all popular pastime activities in North Korea. By the 1970s, North Korean technology started lagging behind that of the rest of the world, and it was acutely aware of that. In the 60s and 70s, North Korea refurbished its energy grid with the help of the Soviets. It modernized its military and tried mechanizing its agricultural sector, but that mostly failed. However, North Korea didn't have the money to pay for all of this, and so it borrowed the money. So much in fact that by 1975 it couldn't repay its loans and simply decided to never repay their loans. After all, it's not like somebody could force North Korea to repay its debt, but this left the country with a major problem. Nobody trusted North Korea anymore to lend them any money, and so it needed to look for a new source of finance. And North Korea's isolation gave it one very important advantage, which most other countries didn't have at the time: secrecy. And while we don't know exactly when, it is thought that around the 1980s North Korea started exporting missiles, and over the years their customers included Iran, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Nigeria, Pakistan and Egypt. Throughout this time, North Korea had been a close ally of the Soviet Union, but in 1991 the USSR collapsed. As a result, North Korea lost a large amount of foreign aid which it used to get from the Soviets, and it lost its largest trading partner. Furthermore, China no longer had to worry about North Korea becoming a Soviet puppet state, and also reduced the amount of funding it was giving to North Korea. As a result, North Korea once again ran out of money. Not only that, in 1994 the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, died and was replaced by his son, Kim Jong-il. As a result, the 90s was a major shift for North Korea. When Kim Jong-il ascended to power in North Korea, he took over a nation with a struggling economy and facing a famine. In order to solve these problems, the new leadership adopted a new policy, the Sungun policy, in which the economy and military are of equal priority, In fact, Sungun literally means military first.
AK-47s for everyone!
In it, the military would lead the economic recovery of the North Korean nation. To secure national independence, the military began developing nuclear weapons. And when North Korea had problems generating enough electricity in the 90s, the military helped build dozens of new dams along the many rivers. So many in fact that today hydroelectric power accounts for 2/3 of North Korea's energy. North Korea even started to replace the Juche policy of self-determination and reliance. Because North Korean soil isn't well suited for agriculture, the government sought to change the country's policy of isolationism by attempting to improve diplomatic ties with other countries. For example, North Korea agreed to pause its own nuclear weapons program in return for arranging the construction of 2 nuclear reactors by mainly South Korean contractors in 1994, halted the testing of a long-range missile in 1999, decreased the amount of violent rhetoric, stopped incursions into the DMZ, and the leaders of North and South Korea met in 2000 to discuss taking steps towards unification. Relations between North Korea and the countries in Europe and Asia were improving, but even though North Korea had improved relationships, it did not receive the financial and economic aid North Korea likely hoped for. Companies were unwilling to invest in a nation whose laws were arbitrary, countries were unwilling to provide more than food aid, and businesses didn't see North Korea as a stable country to do business in. This was probably far too little for North Korea, and relations worsened shortly after when North Korea became more reluctant to dismantle its nuclear program, and the USA's president called North Korea an
axis of evil.
In 2003, North Korea pulled out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and continued developing nuclear weapons for self-defense. After all, if you have a nuke that can destroy entire cities, people tend to be a lot less willing to invade you. By 2006, the country conducted underground tests, and it is widely thought that as of this moment North Korea had access to nuclear bombs. And so North Korea returned back to its policy of isolationism. From their perspective, there was little to gain from the outside world, while the outside world could incite civil unrest similar to what had happened in the Soviet Union. North Korea might look like a nation which arbitrarily opens up only to then break all ties again. But the North Korean perspective is one of fear and suspicion. It knows that South Korea, Japan, Europe or the United States would like nothing more than for North Korea to become part of a unified Korea led by the southern government. Similar to how a united Germany was dominated by West Germany. North Korea's leaders know that they are balancing a starving population with the few resources available to them and does not want to end up like the Soviet Union, who liberalized its economy, broke apart, and where Russia is now a shell of its former self. With the European Union and United States turning former Soviet territories towards the West, while a resurgent China maneuvers itself into the politics of East Asia, which had been in the Russian sphere of influence for centuries. In a world where nuclear weapons deter invasion, where liberalism invites rebellion, and where power is exercised from a strong economy, North Korea is deeply distrustful of anyone who might upset the delicate balance its leaders have built. North Korea is not some irrational actor on the world stage like it is often depicted. Not at all. North Korea's government is consumed by fear. Fear of its own people who might rebel, fear of its allies who might install a new government, and fear of its enemies who might reunify Korea under the South's rule. A South that was becoming more and more powerful. But while North Korea was dealing with the fallout of the Soviet Union's collapse, South Korea was facing issues of democracy. Because even though South Korea held elections, these were often not fair elections. As the popularity of President Park Chung-hee decreased, his methods became more dictatorial. In 1972, the government declared martial law, modified the constitution to give the president rule by decree, and made it nearly impossible for anybody else to run for president. In 1978, President Park was re-elected, as nobody else was allowed to run against him, eventually resulting in protests. When the president wanted to use ever more violent methods to put down the protests, he was assassinated by his own security forces in 1979. A military dictatorship once again took over the South Korean government and used ever-increasing authoritarian methods to secure its own power. Universities were closed, political activities banned, and the freedom of the press further curtailed. But this led to a student demonstration in southern Korea that was supported by the workers. This uprising was brutally suppressed as paratroopers were sent in to take control over from the police. So now the army was being used to suppress its own citizens. With support from political opposition, this protest did help to bring about a new constitution for the country and eventually led to the resignation of the dictator. With this new constitution, the National Assembly gained more power, the president lost power, and the Supreme Court could appoint its own justices instead of the government. But this wasn't enough for the people, and protesters demanding more democracy kept turning to the streets periodically. These protesters were so successful that when, in 1987, a new man was selected to become president, he was so afraid of the protesters that he allowed elections and ran on a platform promising more freedoms to the South Korean people. When he won, his government adopted a new constitution giving more rights to its citizens and letting people vote directly for the president instead of using an electoral college. By the 90s, South Korean democracy had become so successful that 2 former presidents were indicted for corruption, thousands of political prisoners were released, and criminal convictions of pro-democracy protesters were removed. Should you be someone who wants to live in a democracy, yet you live in a country ruled by a dictator, a country whose democracy is being eroded, or a country still struggling to get that democracy, then there is almost no better example to follow than South Korea. Dictator after dictator, protest after protest, death after death. The South Korean people serve as an example to every person seeking democracy. The process from dictatorship to democracy took decades, and even today South Koreans still protest to preserve the democracy they have created for themselves. Yet they never stopped protesting, never stopped demanding an end to the corruption, and never stopped fighting for their right to vote. If you need inspiration for how to democratize your nation, then I highly recommend you look at South Korea. Throughout the 90s, South Korean citizens gained more and more liberties as various methods of oppression were being lifted. In addition, women campaigned for complete legal equality and won enhanced property ownership rights, the right to register as the head of a household in a new family register system that took effect in 2008, equal divorce rights, and improved their legal standing in child custody cases. But the 90s also saw a major economic shift, because in 1997 the Asian financial crisis hit South Korea. Banks had been investing in the large family-owned corporations in order to create large corporations able to compete on the world stage. But by 1997 a lot of money was being lent out, while most of those loans weren't turning a profit, and the massive debt resulted in major business failures across South Korea. As a result, the fast growth of the South Korean economy had come to an end. South Korea had become a developed country, and as a result it was no longer able to use advanced technology to rapidly improve its economy because it already had implemented all of the most advanced technology available. At the same time, a large corruption scandal in South Korea resulted in a bad reputation for doing business in the country. And so the South Korean government started the process of restructuring its economy. South Korea transitioned away from state capitalism, based on the Japanese model, to neoliberal capitalism, based on the US model. And, once again, South Korea became more capitalist than the USA, to the point where South Korea now lectures the USA on the virtues of free trade and shames them for deregulating financial and labor markets. It was to become easier to do business. For example, before, if you wanted to open a factory in South Korea, you would need 299 different permits or bribe officials to get permission. But such bureaucracy was cut down and starting a business was made easier. Corporations had to be more transparent in financial reporting, corporate governance, and debt stabilization in order to avoid further corruption. But the South Korean government also reduced its influence in businesses, in particular the chaebols, the family-run corporations. But while the government was involving itself less with corporations started involving themselves more in the government. In 1988, president of the Hyundai Heavy Industries, part of a chaebol, successfully ran for the National Assembly of South Korea. This was soon followed by various other business leaders joining the National Assembly, with an ever-decreasing separation of business and state. And over time, the corporations have gained more and more power in South Korean politics. Part of this has to do with the fact that the neoliberal economic system allows rich and powerful individuals to join national politics. But another part is the sheer size and wealth the chaebols have in South Korea. Just to give a few examples of just how powerful these companies are, Samsung alone accounts for 20% of all South Korea's exports, and when President Lee Myung-bak took office, he pardoned several business people for tax evasion, such as Samsung Group chairman Lee Kun-hee, Choi Tae-won of SK Group, Chung Mung-ko of Hyundai, Kim Sung-yoon of Hanwha, and Shin Dong-bing of Lot. In essence, these people and their businesses had become more powerful than the law. Or look at Hanbo Group, which bribed politicians to give them large government contracts in favor of their competitors. The list of corruption scandals in South Korea is almost endless. The recent corruption scandal involving the president in 2016 wasn't unique. In fact, South Korea has a large political scandal every few years where high-ranking officials are involved in corruption, rigging elections, illegal surveillance, and much more than I could do justice in this video alone. And even if these companies wanted to completely distance themselves from the politics, the sheer size of these corporations means that any step they take can cause a major shift in the economy. While the modern-day United States also has ever-increasing corporate influence, South Korea's companies are far larger in relation to the national economy than those of the United States, and therefore wield far more power over national politics. Once again, the Koreans are better at the system than the country upon which they base their own system. And South Korea will have to deal with the influence these large corporations have on their society going into the future. Today's Korea is a highly advanced country, one which is famous for cutting-edge design, superior quality, and technological prowess. But it is also famous for something else: K-pop. And the position K-pop holds in South Korea is a very special one, because K-pop is more than just music. K-pop is a weapon, a geopolitical weapon that has been carefully cultivated by the government to promote South Korea across the world. You see, after the Asian financial crisis in the 90s, the South Korean economic growth slowed down to similar levels to that of other developed economies, and so South Korea looked towards a new type of product it could export to the world. And it found this product in its unique culture. Up until the 80s, censorship was common in South Korea. For example, there were only 2 broadcast networks which controlled what South Koreans could listen to. But in 1987, as part of the democratization of the country, these censorships were lifted and new types of music became available from abroad. Rock music, independent music, pop music. And if you look up the famous South Korean media companies, you will find that many of them were founded shortly after the censorship was lifted. By the 90s, the government looked at all these new forms of Korean media and decided that it would start selling this media to the rest of the world. And it is easy to see why. Hollywood or Japanese anime earns billions every year. But it was about more than just money. South Korea also wanted to improve its image to the rest of the world. Because up until the 1990s, most people associated South Korea with the Asian financial crisis, dictatorship, North Korea, violent repression, the Korean War, and poverty. But South Korea now wanted to sell itself as a modern country, a prosperous country, a free country, a country that was an equal of the rest of the developing world. In short, South Korea is trying to portray itself as best Korea. And if you want to sell to the outside world, you need to know about the outside world. After all, the first rule of marketing is know your customer. But South Koreans still weren't allowed to travel abroad freely until the early 90s, when, after decades, the government finally lifted the travel ban. And the South Korean population, which had become richer and richer since the 1960s, used their wealth to travel abroad. In particular, they traveled to Europe and North America. They went as tourists to go sightseeing, they went as students to study, and they went as employees to start their careers. And after a few years, many of these young South Koreans who had been living, studying and working in Western societies came back to South Korea. And they took with them new perspectives on doing business, new forms of innovation, and new interpretations of the arts. And what did those young people do with their new experiences, new expertise and new perspectives? Well, many of them created a new type of Korean art such as music, movies, TV series and video games. And the first South Korean cultural product that became popular abroad were Korean dramas, K-dramas. These were originally intended for the South Korean market, but soon spread to other East Asian nations such as Japan, China and Taiwan, where it gained popularity in the early 2000s. These countries are culturally similar to South Korea, and so East Asian audiences can still enjoy Korean dramas for their recognizable traditional elements. An example of such a common cultural element is Juche, the superior gentleman. This is a stereotype of a man who strives to achieve perfection and self-actualization, blending the values of altruism and self-autonomy to signify the ideal man. This often takes the form of rulers, husbands and elder brothers. And if you live in East Asia and are sick of the myriad of Hollywood movies in your life, it is refreshing to see media which is closer to your own culture, which you can better identify with, and which has high production values. The government then used cultural festivals to display Korean culture, conducting PR campaigns to promote South Korean uniqueness, and supported the entertainment businesses by making it easier to do business. This process of Korean culture spreading across the world is known as the Korean Wave, or Hallyu. And the Korean Wave was carefully engineered by the Samsung Research Institute. First, you create a popularity for Korean culture. Next, people will purchase Korean cultural products. Next, people will buy other Korean products such as cosmetics or food. And lastly, this leads to a favorable impression of South Korea. And if you're like me and hear about this for the first time, you might recognize some of these stages you have taken yourself. I first saw Gangnam Style in 2012. I started listening to some more K-pop in 2013. I bought Korean cosmetics in 2014, and when I had a South Korean boss in 2016, I had such a favorable view of South Korea that I actively asked her questions about her culture. And now I'm even making a video about Korea, perpetuating the cycle. And South Korean cultural products are becoming more and more popular abroad. More Korean restaurants, more Korean language students, and more people visiting South Korea. The rise of Korean culture, from K-pop to K-dramas to K-cuisine, was not a fluke. It was a carefully crafted strategy to spread Korean culture across the world for the benefit of South Korea. And K-pop was used as a method to get foreigners to begin their interest in South Korean culture. It started with a band called Seo Taiji and the Boys in the 90s with the song I Know. where US pop music was fused with South Korean culture. Between 1995 and 98, 3 large studios were founded to cultivate what would become known as idol groups. SM Entertainment, no, not the fun kind, JYP Entertainment, and YG Entertainment. The first of these custom-made idol groups was Hot in 1996, which was created by assembling 5 singers and dancers whom the producers believed represented what teens wanted to see from a modern pop group. And this evolved to a K-pop which focuses on exceptionally high-quality performance such as dancing, an extremely polished aesthetic, an assembly line studio production which makes regular musical hits. And throughout the decades, K-pop has remained highly segregated, where bands are made solely of either male or female performers, where male groups cover a wide range of topics, while female groups generally fall into 3 themes. The shy schoolgirl singing about their crush, a woman seeking an older male figure to fulfill their fantasies, and women who reject male validation. And this media has even penetrated North Korea, where the idealized South Korean life so often portrayed in South Korean TV, music and movies spurred almost all North Korean refugees to flee their country. North Korean government apparently sees South Korean media as a dangerous threat to its stability. In fact, being caught with foreign media is a serious crime. Being caught with South Korean media is a really serious crime. Yet even so, many North Koreans watch foreign media, but always on a low volume, and keeping an eye out for inspectors to not get caught. North Korean refugees even state that some weddings have 2 parts. One with songs approved by the government, and a secret ceremony incorporating rituals borrowed from South Korean media. As methods of storing digital information have grown smaller and smaller, from VCR to DVD to USB, it has become easier to smuggle them into North Korea. As a result, foreign media becomes increasingly more widespread. And even though North Korea has a lot of hydroelectric power plants, power outages are still common, making it difficult to watch such foreign media. But luckily for North Koreans, the cost of solar panels has dropped, and it is estimated that today around 55% of all North Korean households use solar panels to generate power. And with the death of Kim Jong-il in 2011, life for most average North Koreans has improved. Kim Jong-il was succeeded by his son Kim Jong-un, and under his leadership, the country has reformed its economy to be more efficient. There had been a prominent black market in North Korea where people would trade goods outside of government oversight, but in the 2010s, the government started legalizing more and more of such activities. For example, while before farmers had to give any surplus food to the state, more recently, farmers are allowed to sell a small portion of their crops on an open market, where they are allowed to set their own prices. This generally increases productivity because if you can increase the profit you make by producing more food, then you are incentivized to find new ways to produce more food. And the North Korean government also has become less isolationist and less belligerent in the 21st century. For example, in 1983 its agents blew up a delegation of South Koreans in Myanmar, killing several cabinet members. In 1987 it downed a South Korean airliner. But such activities have stopped. The regime of Kim Jong-un has had to deal with the widespread sanctions imposed against the country, starting with the United States in the 50s, to the European Union in the 2000s, to most countries in the world by the 2010s. North Korea had never traded much with the outside world, but did have some trade relationships with them to sell the vast natural resources and cheap products to foreign countries. So, what did North Korea do in response to all these sanctions? North Korea did what almost every country does when they face sanctions. They avoid them. But how? North Korea is able to exploit the fears of China, particularly the fear that if the North Korean government collapses, that millions of North Korean refugees might flood into China, that the nuclear weapons it had been building will fall in the hands of local warlords who might use those weapons to hold China hostage by threatening to blow up a few Chinese cities. And that North Korea might unify with South Korea and become a capitalist pro-USA nation. And so China keeps trading with North Korea despite officially putting sanctions on North Korea. But it also keeps trading with the rest of the world through China. Because North Korean labor is so cheap, many Chinese businesses will gladly buy North Korean goods such as clothing, add the Made in China label, and then sell it to the rest of the world for a large profit. Some of you watching are probably wearing clothes made in North Korea. And through this policy, North Korea had to once again attach itself more and more to a larger, more powerful neighbor, this time the People's Republic of China. And with all this talk about hydroelectric dams, nuclear weapons and heavy industry, it would be prudent to look at the education of North Korea. Interestingly, education has been an important part of North Korean society. While it suffers from famine and is quite poor, its people are better educated than most other developing countries. It has had compulsory education for all children up to the age of 11 for most of its history, and many North Koreans are trained as engineers, nuclear physicists, and many other high-skilled jobs. It is therefore wrong for people to assume that North Koreans are uneducated and stupid people who don't know what's going on in their country or the world around them. In fact, many North Koreans often listen or watch South Korean media. Many of them live and work in China, and many North Koreans do receive news about the outside world. So even though the country is very isolated from the rest of the world, it is important to note that these people are no different than us. And if we can see through the lies our politicians tell us, so can they see through the lies of their politicians. And it would be wrong of us to assume that they are somehow stupid. And so we arrive in 2020, the year this video was made and where history comes to an end for now. And while this video only focused on a part of the history of North Korea and South Korea, there are many more parts which I did not cover in this video. So when someone comments about how I did not cover certain parts of Korean history, such as re-education camps, various presidential scandals, or abolishing the power of the land-owning elites in South Korea, then they are probably right. And I cannot cover everything important in a short video like this. People can spend a lifetime studying Korea and still learn new things. So if you were thinking I skipped something important, then please comment down below and teach us more about the Korean Peninsula. I always look forward to learning more about the subject of my videos. And if you like this video, then please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next video will be about India after independence, and you can vote on the video after that in the poll in the description. This was Avery from HistoryScope. Thank you for watching. Join the Discord server.